Sounds good. And also, we are live now. Welcome everyone on Facebook. Welcome everyone on YouTube. We are live streaming now on November 21, 2021. It's a special time. We've got a special topic today, and we have Dr. John Hatcher as our presenter. I will start with a speaker biography. Dr. John Hatcher is Professor Emeritus in English Literature at the University of South Florida in Tampa, where he taught for 40 years. He is a poet, a lecturer, translator, author, and he's published 25 books, some of which have been translated into French, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, German, and Norwegian. He has also published more than 100 poems and articles and has been editor of the Journal of Baha'i Studies for the past 7 years. If you haven't heard of it, the Association for Baha'i Studies, it is an amazing organization. You should try joining it and learning from the amazing scholars that contribute to that organization, the Association for Baha'i Studies. Now, Dr. Hatcher has been a guest lecturer at such distinguished institutions such as the University of Michigan, McGill University in Canada, the University of Maryland, Emory University, Oxford University. He has received various awards for his work, including the Hassan Beiluzi Lectureship at the 29th Annual Meeting of the North American Association for Studies on the Baha'i Faith. And he's also, together with fellow translator Amrullah Hammat, he has translated 3 books of poetry by Tahireh, a renowned Persian poet. She is a famous person that stood up for women's rights, the emancipation of women. You should check her out, Tahireh. He is presently teaching a weekly course on the Baha'i Faith, and recordings of this can be found on his website, johnshatcher.com. I'll repeat, www.john, Johns, as in Sam, Hatcher, HATCHER.com. It would be amazing if you visit, because every Wednesday he has Zoom meetings he hosts, which you can come and ask your questions live, of course. But then he's also has, for the past year, recordings that you can go in and watch, and it's amazing. You should check it out. So this week's topic is life on other planets. In the vast and endless universe, where countless galaxies and an infinitude of solar systems exist, each with planets that might be capable of producing life, there must surely be other human civilizations in various stages of physical and social evolution. In the light of such a context, is it logical for us to imagine that planet Earth has some special or central role to play in God's plan for his creation? And if there is human life elsewhere, why have they not contacted us, or at least made themselves available to us? And were planet Earth to disappear, would God's plan for creation come to an end or be adversely affected? Once we use the Baha'i writings to respond to these questions, what should be our attitude about ourselves as individuals, as a community, and in the long run, as a planetary commonwealth? With that being said, Dr. Hatcher, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours. The community welcomes you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate everyone who is attending today, and are those of you who are watching a recording of this presentation. I gave a presentation, the official title of this presentation, in addition to what John said, is The Body of God. And I gave a presentation on this topic, or with this name, several years ago when the translation of the Suri Hakel came out. And the whole premise of that was simply that the Hakel, which is a 5-pointed star, is a traditional symbol of the human temple, of the human body. And in the Suri Hakel, the Hakel, or the star, represents the manifestation. And so the obvious point I was trying to make in analyzing, not in detail, but just an overview of the Suri Hakel, which is a very important tablet by Baha'u'llah, is that he is describing what the manifestation's purpose is, what struggles the manifestation must endure, and he includes in that work 5 letters to kings and rulers of his day that he had written separately, but in the final rendering of that work in the form of a star or a 5-pointed star, he includes those 5 letters. And for reasons that I try to explain. Today's talk is a little bit different on the body of God, in the sense that I'm sort of going in a different direction. No, well, not a different direction, but sort of being more inclusive or more broad. So let me start sharing my screen, and I'm going to present you as much as we are able to get through a PowerPoint on the body of God with various quotes that go in a kind of logical sequence. We begin with several axiomatic concepts that don't all derive from the Baha'i teachings, but are confirmed by the Baha'i teachings. First, we begin with the idea that a complexification based on fallacy leads to chaos. Now, what does that mean? It means when we're looking at reality and we try to take in ever more complex view of reality, if our premise with which we approach reality is based on wrong information or a wrong premise, then we're going to end up with chaos. And the example that you can most easily rely on to understand this is the Ptolemaic view of the cosmos. And that is the view that the earth is the center of creation and the center of the universe. And parallel to that is the Baha'i concept of the fact that if you look at religious history with the view that one religion is the main religion or superior to the other religions or distinct from the other religions, then you're starting with a fallacious concept, because the Baha'i teachings say all the religions are really one religion revealed in progressive and successive stages. The only problem that has deterred humankind from realizing that is they don't have the correct premise, this idea of what Baha'is call progressive revelation. And so with past revelations that had no enduring covenant, especially as regards to successorship, and we're talking here about who succeeds after the prophet or manifestation is gone, or institutional design and preparation for transference of authority to the next prophet or manifestation when he appears, the more complex the religion became and the less stable it became, and the more susceptible to petty quarrels, internecine struggles for power, incoherent doctrine, and baseless man-made legalisms became. And so we see that, just to give a quick example, with Christianity, for example. Even though Christ seems to have appointed Peter as the head of his church, Peter didn't actually design an institution. And after Peter, of course, you have this schism after schism in the Christian church, and it became ever more complex. So when you talk about Christianity worldwide today, you're talking about a myriad of different denominations and churches and theologies. So complexification based on the truth leads to simplification. So in other words, if you take all these many beliefs that exist throughout the world and throughout human history, these different revelations or religions, and you look at them through a Baha'i lens, this idea that they're really all successive and progressive expressions of the same spiritual truth, but fashioned according to the needs of the time in which they appear. In other words, as human civilization becomes more complex, then so does the religion need to become more complex in its ability to give order and meaning to those. With the advent of the teachings of Baha'u'llah, the more immersed we become in the details surrounding the confusion in the history of world religions, the more we come to embrace and delight in the simplicity of the paradigm set forth in the authoritative Baha'i explanations regarding why past dispensations, and that's the dispensation is the length of the religion or the length it was meant to endure, declined or went awry, and what safeguards are provided to prevent this same degradation or degeneration in the future. And this is called then this idea of simplicity bringing about the most likely answer to a complex question is called the law of parsimony, or sometimes pronounced parsimony, sometimes parsimony. The simplest answer is the most likely correct answer, and this is often called Occam's razor, named after Occam, who proposed this idea that the simplest answer is most likely to cut through the morass of misinformation. So in other words, when you take the Ptolemaic theory of the Earth being the center of the universe, the more you observe about the cosmos, such as the retrograde motion of Mars, you try to fit that into the Ptolemaic system, and you end up with these epicycles, and it gets pretty chaotic. Whereas when Copernicus in the 16th century proposed that what if we make the sun the center of the universe, then all of these complexification of this becomes quite simple. And we have, of course, a more accurate rendering of cosmology. So one principal verity and a starting point for the argument we're going to make, and the argument in this case, or the theme of this talk, is that if God is a personal God, as he is described in the Baha'i writings, and yet essentially unknowable, then what is the means by which we know him? And we start out with a Baha'i axiom, and this is a quote from Abdul Baha: "The spiritual world is likened to the phenomenal world. They are the exact counterpart of each other. Whatever objects appear in this world of existence are the outer pictures of the world of heaven." So you get this idea of two dimensions of reality: a spiritual or metaphysical realm, and the realm we live in presently, which is the physical realm. Each is the counterpart. Now, what does that mean? Well, exactly what it says, that everything in the physical world is a mirror of some reality in the spiritual realm. In effect, as I point out we'll get to that in just a second. This means that doesn't mean there's two realities, but two dimensions of a single reality. There can be only one reality if by reality we mean all that exists, whether metaphysical or physical. Reality may include various dimensions, two of which we know a little about, the physical and the metaphysical. However, this assertion flies in the face of the notions that we hear bandied about by some philosophers and cosmologists of multiverse, of there being multiple universes, each one of which would necessarily require its own deity, but only if one accepts that there is a creator required to have a creation. So the possibility of an infinitely expanding social expression of spiritual verities becomes another Baha'i axiom, and that is we believe that you have these various, you can look at it in terms of concentric circles that expand as our experience individually and collectively as a human civilization becomes more complex. You have your family, of course, the most, and your neighbors, the most finite of these expressions of social unity, the tribe or village and the council, the city-state, and the introduction of a constitutional governments, which occurs with Muhammad, the nation state and its subsidiary institutions, and the alliances and ecumenism of both governance and religion, where you have various nations forming alliances, something we saw in the past century, the 20th century, with the attempt of the League of Nations, then the United Nations, and other alliances, NATO, and so on. Then you have what Baha'is say will ultimately occur, that is in the process of coming about now, and that is ultimately you will have, we already see the need for it, planetary governance. In other words, you have global institutions, and of course we already have some of those, or at least attempts at them, with global courts, and but we obviously need, as we see with the pandemic, global medical concerns, global concerns for the providing of the essentials of life for all the people on our small planet. In other words, ultimately we outgrow the need for or the usefulness of segregating the planet into separate communities that are trying to be autonomous, trying to, in effect, be self-sufficient. It just doesn't work anymore because we've, as we see now with the backup of the conveyance of goods throughout the world, that you need planetary systems of all sorts of things, whether it's power and electricity, whether it's food and staples of life, or in the case of the electronics and so forth. And so is it possible, and this gets to what John was talking about in the introduction to the talk, is it possible to have an even wider circumference of social interaction, interplanetary alliances? Well, of course, science fiction has posed this possibility for many, many years. But of course, unfortunately, usually these interactions are not felicitous. Usually going all the way back to the idea of the Martians invading and so on. Well, of course, we've invaded Mars with our little instruments and so on. And don't think that Martians are going to retaliate anytime soon. The point is that clearly, if you look at, well, let's look at a progression here insofar as my own writing is concerned, very quickly. I started out, and this was in 1977, writing a book called The Metaphorical Nature of Physical Reality, which basically is a restatement of the axiom I mentioned earlier, that the spiritual world is reflected in, or put it in the reverse order, the physical world is a counterpart or symbolic or metaphorical or figurative expression of the spiritual world. And the conclusion I come to in this study is this is a purposeful arrangement by the Creator, so that while we're in our physical stage of existence as spiritual beings, essentially spiritual beings, that the physical experience serves as a classroom for us to learn about spiritual verities. Because we can't learn about abstractions just right off the bat. We have to see the abstraction played out for us. So if you talk about what is justice, well, it's kind of meaningless unless you see it acted out in a just relationship. And one of the quotes from the writings of Baha'u'llah that to me sort of states this point blank: know thou that every created thing is a sign of the revelation of God, each according to its capacity is and will ever remain a token of the Almighty. Were the hand of divine power to divest of this high endowment all created things, the entire universe would become desolate and void. In other words, the intended purpose of creation by the Creator is to teach us spiritual concepts. Then in a next iteration of, or a more expansive iteration of this concept, the purpose of physical reality, I add to this the idea of how this life relates explicitly to the next life, how our lessons learned here are played out in the continuity of our lives after we dissociate. And this is an important concept in the Baha'i teachings, that the soul is the source of our essential human powers, our thought, our rational mind, our memory, and so on. And so the soul associates with the body. It's not in the body or dependent on the body. And so when we pass on beyond this realm, when our body is no longer capable of channeling, if you will, the intent of our soul and mind, then our soul and mind continue to exist, but without the need to express itself through a physical edifice. And indeed, from a Baha'i point of view, this first life, or second, if you consider the life in the womb, the first expression of our birth, and then we are born into this life, and then we're born into the next life, then you can appreciate that this life is but preparation for the next life, in the same way as Baha'u'llah says, as the life in the womb is preparation, has no purpose other than preparing us for this life. So this life has no other purpose than to prepare us for the life after, well, I would say after death, but it's life after this life. The justification for essentially spiritual beings taking their beginning in a physical environment is that physical reality as the initial stage in the endless journey of the human soul is a precisely devised classroom whereby autonomous transformation is initiated and assisted as preparation for birth into a spiritual existence. That's a quote from the book, and pretty well sums up, as I say, the purpose of that book. Then a third book I wrote called The Ascent of Society takes this individual concept of what we do personally to prepare for our ascent or our further life in the realm of the spirit, and says that the axiomatic statement of this book is personal development is impossible without social development. That is, it's inseparable from it. And to give you but a simple example, we'll go back to the one I just mentioned, the virtue of justice. How can you know if you're just unless you interact with other people? And you'll find that most spiritual attributes or virtues can only be understood and expressed and developed in terms of relationship with other people. And so the idea of the ascetic life, which was part of, well, Christianity and very many other religions, is abolished by Baha'u'llah. He said that this is no longer appropriate because we are trying to create a global community. And basically, he says that not only is it not good for the development of an individual to be alone and isolated to develop spiritually, but it deprives the society of that person's contribution. To put it in a way that's always been enlightening to me, or expressive of this idea, is that if you have someone who lives in a cave and becomes and meditates and prays and thinks he or she is very spiritual, let them try to come out and participate in society, get a job, and raise a family, and see how really spiritual they are. In other words, it takes practice. Most individual spiritual growth cannot take place in solitude because the array of virtues and attributes that constitute the good person are indicative of and conducive to spiritual development, require and derive from the nature of our interaction with others. The good person manifests and develops the attributes of goodness by behaving in a noble way in human relationships. Otherwise, goodness is totally theoretical. So that's a quote from this third book. A fourth book I wrote, God's Plan for Planet Earth, gets very explicit about the plan of Baha'u'llah and of the present Baha'i world community as administrated by the institution Baha'u'llah himself ordained, the Universal House of Justice, is talking about the very explicit and progressive plans for how you create these global systems. And so the Baha'i faith worldwide follows these plans and thereby creates communities throughout the world very intentionally and for the same purpose, and that is ultimately to create not to eliminate the family and the village and so on, because they are all still necessary, but to make a larger incorporation of these villages, families and villages and cities and territories into one coordinated global community. And this is a quote from the World Order of Baha'u'llah that's very important insofar as the rest of my presentation is concerned, and really gets at the heart of the beginning of this concept that John mentioned at the outset, namely, is it possible that there is not other life, human life, on other planets? And if there is, why don't we know about it? And so we'll take it from there. So the emergence of a world community, the consciousness of world citizenship, the founding of a world civilization and culture, all of which must synchronize with the initial stages in the unfoldment of the golden age of the Baha'i era, which the Baha'is believe will indeed occur, should by their very nature be regarded, as far as this planetary life is concerned, as the furthermost limits in the organization of human society, though man as an individual will, nay, must indeed, as a result of such a consummation, continue indefinitely to progress and develop. Now, that last part is very important. It doesn't, because it means that we never get to an end point insofar as our individual spiritual development is concerned, or as our social expression of spiritual development is concerned. So even though the planetary system that Baha'u'llah has described and prescribed is the most sophisticated structure you can get on a planetary level, it doesn't mean that that's the end of progress. It means then once you get that structure, you can refine it infinitely. There is no point at which you have gone as far as you can go. Then another book, and there's no cover because it's not published yet, but it has been written, called The Body of God, which is precisely, well, not precisely, but somewhat like this talk is about. This begins more with a very detailed analysis of the Suri Hakel, the tablet of the temple, or the surah of the temple. Can there be human unity beyond the planetary level? Does the Baha'i faith say anything about that? And it does. And this is a quote. It's not an authoritative quote. You can see down here at the bottom that it's from Pilgrim's Notes, from 1954. And a pilgrim's note is simply someone who went on pilgrimage to the Baha'i World Center, and in this case met with Shoghi Effendi, who was the last single individual head of the Baha'i faith prior to the creation of the House of Justice. And he was asked if interplanetary unity would be the goal of the future dispensations, or if it might be achieved in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. He answered, it would be a goal of the future, but science is developing so fast that it was difficult to know how soon it would come, but it might at least soon be possible to observe life on other systems that are in various stages of development. Now, this last part is very important. Some lower and some higher than ours. This last part here, some lower and some higher than ours, this is sort of the key to the main query of this whole discussion. Irrefutable logic underlying this theory. Humankind has always existed. Now, what is this talking about? This is an axiom stated by Abdul Baha in a book called Some Answered Questions, which is almost an encyclopedia of spiritual and philosophical questions. By the appearance of the spirit in the physical form, this world is enlightened, meaning by God producing human beings that have spiritual capacity. The world becomes enlightened. In other words, you create society. And the theory goes on that without this appearance, there would be no progress. As the spirit of man is the cause of the life of the body, so the world in the condition of the body is in the condition of the body, and man is in the condition of the spirit. If there were no man, the perfections of the spirit would not appear, and the light of the mind would not be resplendent in the world. This world would be like a body without a soul. And in other places, he repeats this in other ways by saying, without the advent of these manifestations who come as teachers from God to help the progress of human beings, both individually and collectively, the world would be a pasture of animal appetites, and there would be no progress, no social evolution. And he goes on, and this is a continuation of a statement by his, and that is that even though this planet has not always existed, the human being has always existed. Now, think about that for a second. And you see the logical inference or deduction from that, I should say, is if man has always existed, but this planet has not always existed, then if the Baha'i writings are correct, then man must have existed someplace else prior to the creation of this planet. The reflection of the divine perfection appears in the reality of man. So he is the representative of God, the messenger of God. If man did not exist, the universe would be without result, for the object of existence is the appearances of the perfections of God. So the means, if you will, by which God makes his perfections and attributes appear in the world is through the creation of a being capable of understanding those perfections and implementing them in personal and collective action. So man has always existed, even though this planet has not. Therefore, it cannot be said there was a time when man was not. All that we can say is that this terrestrial globe at one time did not exist, and at its beginning, man did not appear upon it. Ergo, human life has existed on other planets. Now, that last part is my own conclusion, though it's patently obvious. Progressively expanding sense of the concept of reality. And so we begin, as we look at review history, you've got particular areas of civilization and the growth of civilization and the growth of the concept or the evolution of the concept of reality. So at first you have, say, in the Mediterranean region, though we know there was simultaneously probably other regions that also had very extensive and progressive growth. You have at that time the global concept of the Ptolemaic perspective. Earth is the center of all creation. And then you had, as we said, the heliocentric perspective, and so it's other-centered. So we see that, of course, this went against not only the doctrines of the church, but it went against the hubris, if you will, of humankind, because if we aren't the center, then what is the center if we aren't? So as we increase in our ability to observe celestial phenomena over time, we come up with the concept of the galaxy, which has within it other solar systems. And so you think that, well, possibly some planet on those other solar systems exists in what is called the Cinderella position of being not too close and not too far, but just right. It's not Cinderella. What is it called? I forget. But at any rate, in other words, where you're not too close to the star or sun that around which the planets in that solar system revolve, and not too far away. The Goldilocks it is. I'm sorry, not Cinderella, the Goldilocks. Of course, that's the analogy of the soup being not too hot and not too cold. The galactic cluster is something that we have more recently understood, and that is, even as the galaxy, like a solar system, revolves around a center, so there are entire galactic clusters that revolve around a center. So the exponential increase in the possibilities of life on other planets. They are essentially numberless, and that is, there are estimates of how many solar systems there are in the Milky Way galaxy and how many galaxies they are that we can count, but they really are beyond calculation. Excuse me, let me take a sip of my tea. A Baha'i view of an infinite but organically unified cosmos. Now, the Baha'i writings are replete with passages that talk about the endless universe and the countless stars. If that is taken literally, it means infinity is not only possible, but logical. In other words, how could you have a point of ending of creation? Even with the hot Big Bang theory, if something had to precede the hot Big Bang, such as another Big Bang. So if you look at that as sort of a pulsing heart in creation, you still have a reality that the Baha'i says is infinite in the past, infinite in the future. No beginning, no ending. Now, you don't have to agree with that, but this is a Baha'i statement. And so you have, then to look at this graphically, you have the Ptolemaic system with the Earth as the center, and then the last circle being the fixed stars, which was where all the stars were presumed to be on a fixed globe that rotated. Of course, once you see that the stars themselves move in relation to one another, you realize that that's improbable. But of course, there were various versions or iterations of the Ptolemaic system. And then you come to the Copernican system, which we've mentioned, which seems accurate. And you have the galactic structure. And this would be a rendering of the Milky Way galaxy. And this is a series of galactic clusters. And here are, you have A, B, C, D, E, and F down there. These are 5 galactic clusters seen from a distance. And these are actual photographs taken from the Hubble telescope. So if we return to our own knowledge of what we know of the Milky Way galaxy, and so we see that the sun and the solar system that we live in as part of this galactic structure, we are, as you can see, rotating around the center of the galaxy. And as this says, the orbit of the solar system around the galaxy takes 225 million years. And so that means that we have only a little over 22 more orbits left before our sun runs out of fuel and our solar system depletes, or the sun depletes its energy, and our solar system disappears. So we know our solar system has a beginning. We know it has an end. We know that human life at some point evolves on it. And so we cannot imagine that there's not the same process occurring on other solar systems and other planets. Why would they not? What would make this a distinct experiment on the part of God? And the answer is, as far as I can understand, there's none whatsoever. And if you have an infinite universe with infinite galaxies, and I'm not saying that this is a proven thing, but it is something you can infer from the Baha'i writings, then how could you say there's not a possibility of infinite number of planets with human beings on them, but at least many of them? Now, this brings them to, we'll finish up this idea of the existence of our own galaxy. Our own planet and our own planetary system, the solar system. We needn't worry because that's approximately 4.5 billion years away. And we know that it's been 4.5 billion years approximately since the planet began. And so that's a good thing. That should give us hope. We don't have to worry that anytime soon that's going to occur. So a God that can create this infinite universe might seem distant to us. In other words, we might feel that how can this God have any concern about me as an individual? How could he have time to? Or we say he, even though God is not gender defined or circumscribed, but we use this just as a tradition. But this being is said to be personal. Now, what do we mean by that when we think that this God is responsible for all these planets and all the souls on this planet? Is it possible that God can possibly be sufficiently vast and complex to have individual concern for us? And so Shoghi Effendi defines what is meant by this term. What is meant by personal God is a God who is conscious of his creation, who has a mind. In other words, it's not just the accumulation of all the forces in the universe. You have people now I notice people are fond of creating in dialogues in contemporary movies and so on. Instead of using God, they'll say the universe wants you to do this, and it's a way of escaping being atheistic without being and still having the room for religious possibilities. But this is saying something quite different, that it's not just the amorphous universe with all of its powers and collective capacities. God is a being who has a mind, a will, a purpose, and not, as many scientists and materialists believe, an unconscious and determined force operating in the universe. To say that God is a personal reality does not mean that he has a physical form, which would seem to contradict the whole theme of my talk, the body of God. Or does it in any way resemble a human being? Or does, I said, does it, nor does God resemble a human being. To entertain such a belief would be sheer blasphemy. And of course, the grossest sort of anthropomorphic view of God, even though that's the only way we can understand beings, is in terms of sort of an extrapolation or expansion of our understanding of human beings. We have to imagine a being somewhat like ourselves, or at least having a memory, a will, thought, decisions to make, choices to make, and so on. In the Book of Certitude, Baha'u'llah proclaims unequivocally the existence and oneness of a personal God, unknowable and inaccessible, but the source of all revelation, eternal, omniscient, omnipresent, and almighty. So some of these might seem contradictory to you. If God is unknowable and inaccessible, how can he be at the same time personal and concerned with us? Well, it means, notice, he is essentially unknowable and inaccessible. That is, we can't understand the essence of God, though we know what God is like, especially if you remember slides ago when we read that everything in creation manifests some attribute of God. So God is immanently knowable, but God's essence is not knowable. And so our whole purpose, the Baha'i teachings say, is to know God. That's what we're here to learn about. And so all of creation is there to help teach us. And this is the noonday prayer of the Baha'is. I bear witness, O my God, that thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. Well, how can we know and worship something that is unknowable? Well, again, this is a quote from the Suri Hakel that appears in the book, The Summons of the Lord of Hosts. And it is a statement from the Holy Spirit. And of course, this is not literally true. This is an allegory where the Holy Spirit says to the temple, to the manifestation, O living temple, we verily have made thee a mirror unto the kingdom of names, that thou mayest be amidst all mankind a sign of my sovereignty, a herald unto my presence, a summoner unto my beauty, and a guide into my straight and perspicuous path. So in other words, where all of us are capable of mirroring the attributes of God, the living temple or the manifestation is a distinct order of being, and not only has the capacity to do this, but does it inherently and does it perfectly. And this brings us to, of course, the statement, if you'll remember, of Christ, those of you who have studied Christianity, famous quote in John 14, 6-7, where Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. If ye had known me, you should have known my Father also. And from henceforth ye know him and have seen him. In other words, the best way we can know God, the most perfect way, is by knowing the manifestations, because they're like unto perfect mirrors reflecting the attributes of God. Now, I'm going to skip ahead. Let me see here. Each manifestation is the perfect, as I said, the perfect the perfect representative of God. And so we have two duties prescribed to us to know and to worship, of course, we said in that prayer. And these are stated in the book of laws by Baha'u'llah, the Kitab-i Aqdas, that the first is to recognize the manifestation, to recognition of him who is the dayspring of the revelation. And the second is to follow whatever he tells us to do, to follow his teachings. And Baha'u'llah says these twin duties are inseparable, neither is acceptable without the other. You could also say neither is possible without the other. And that is, you can't really know God until you do the things he prescribes you to do, among which is to pray and to converse with God through the manifestation. Neither can you and conversely, you don't know how to act these out unless you recognize the manifestation as bearing the spiritual attributes of God. So not only can we know God, we can enter his presence. And this is a lengthy discussion in the Kitab-i Gand, the most important doctrinal work of Baha'u'llah, where he says when we talk about entering the presence of God, which is also talked about in the Quran, and of course, which was talked about implicitly in the passage we just read from Christ, that by entering his presence, we enter the presence of God. It doesn't mean literally, however, by being in the physical presence of the manifestation. By attaining, therefore, to the presence of these holy luminaries, the presence of God himself is attained. From their knowledge, the knowledge of God is revealed, excuse me, and from the light of their countenance, the splendors of the face of God is made manifest. But again, this does not necessarily mean that entering their presence is physical. It is by reading their writings, studying their lives, and emulating their conduct. Therefore, whosoever in whatever dispensation hath recognized, excuse me, I'm going to have some more tea. Again, this is part of the same discussion in the Kitab-i-Iqan. Therefore, whosoever and in whatever dispensation hath recognized and attained into the presence of these glorious, these resplendent, and these most excellent luminaries hath verily attained into the presence of God himself and entered the city of eternal and immortal life. So, what about in the next life will we experience the presence of God? And Shoghi Effendi in a letter says, we will have experience of God's spirit in the next life through his prophets, but God is too great for us to know without this intermediary. The prophets know God, but how is more than our human minds can grasp. We believe we may attain in the next world to seeing the prophets. So then is the manifestation the answer to what I was bringing up as the title, the body of God? Is this manifestation, therefore, effectively the body of God? Well, to the extent that godliness can be expressed in terms understandable to a human being, but not in any literal sense. To imagine the body of God, we must contemplate, and that A should not be there, something more expansive and encompassing than progressive spiritual evolution on a single planet, because we must believe that God is a God to the beings on all planets, because there is no multiverse. Everything that exists is one organic whole, and we're beginning to observe that in our cosmological observations. So God is eternal and infinite. If material creation is a perfect counterpart of the spiritual realm, then infinity in time, space, and plenitude must be axiomatic. Now, what do I mean by that? What I'm saying is that if this world, this meaning not this planet or this solar system, but the entirety of creation is a counterpart to the spiritual world, and the spiritual world is clearly infinite, there can be no constraints on metaphysics, then we would argue, or we would conclude, or at least I do, you may not agree, you don't have to, that this world, the physical world, is also eternal in time and in space and in plenitude. In other words, the amount of things, including human beings and planets. This does not mean there is no organic form and functioning to this unified reality. Ultimately, they are not two realities, but rather at least two dimensions or views of a single reality. Therefore, should we not learn to embrace infinity rather than fear it or be repelled by its possible existence? That should be possible, not possibly. Math itself acknowledges this reality, does it not? In other words, all you need to do to create reality with math is keep adding a 1 to any other number, and you have no stopping point. This is a statement that vindicates what I said earlier about this having an organic form or unity here. This is a statement by Abdu'l-Baha. This limitless universe, and again, you can take that literally, I do, or you can take it as being relatively limitless insofar as we are concerned, is like the human body. All the members of which are connected and linked with one another, or T, with the greatest strength. how much the organs, the members, and the parts of the body of man are intermingled and connected for mutual aid and help, and how much they influence one another. In the same way, the parts of this infinite universe have their members and elements connected with one another and influence another spiritually and materially. So we come to this passage from the writings of Baha'u'llah: the whole universe reflecteth his glory. And again, we're talking here not about the solar system, but the whole universe. While he is himself independent of and transcendeth his creatures. In other words, he doesn't depend on the universe for his own being. This is a willful and purposeful act on his part to express his love. This is the true meaning of divine unity. He who is the eternal truth is the one power who exerciseth undisputed sovereignty over the world of being, whose image is reflected in the mirror of the entire creation. Therefore, can we not conclude then that the cosmos ontologically, and that means in the nature of its being, replicates to the extent possible all the dimensions, powers, and attributes of the metaphysical realm, including unity of organization, unity of purpose, and unity of being? Finally, I have a presentation about why an autonomous, self-sufficient being or creator would think it a good idea for essentially spiritual beings, we who are the fruit of his creation, to endure an experience that is ostensibly contrary to our nature. And this goes back to the hadith of the hidden treasure, which if you're not aware of, you should look up and study. But it says the purpose in creating us is for God to have a being capable of receiving the love he wishes to give. The closest thing I think we come to it as individuals is in being a parent, where we sacrifice our personal comfort in order to bestow love upon another being. But in any case, the final idea is simply this. Effectively, from my point of view, and then you can take this in however you wish, you can consider whether you agree with it or not. I have the feeling that in one sense, and in one sense only, the whole created universe is like unto the body of God, in the sense that God is essentially spiritual and unknowable, but so in one sense is the material expression of godliness, which is the entire infinite universe itself. So even though we will never completely know either, we can know all we can about it and how it works. So that's the essential idea, though I need to conclude with one final point. And this is probably the one that was most anticipated by the topic itself, and that is, are there people on other planets? And if they are, why have they not contacted us? Or why have they not allowed us to contact them? And my answer to that would be simply this. If you know the process of progressive revelation, what a civilization or civilizations on a planet must go through before they achieve global unity, then you know that the steps required for that should not be interrupted any more than you would interrupt the progress of a child going through the various grade levels. You wouldn't try to take a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old and expect them to understand nuclear physics or some other great concept until they've had basic understanding of the expression of the principles involved in that at lesser levels or lower levels. You wouldn't interfere, in other words, with that education. So you can presume that if someone from another planet has already achieved global unity, the last thing they want to do is interfere with what we have to go through to create our own global unity, which the Baha'i Writings say will be a great test, which we are now experiencing with the pandemic, with wars, and all sorts of internecine conflicts. So in other words, if they were capable of contacting us, they would, out of their own wisdom and goodness, not interfere and not say, look, we're driving these vehicles that are invisible or can go faster than the speed of light. It wouldn't do us any good. It would harm us. And conversely, and let me take one more sip of tea. Conversely, if when we have, and we will have, the power to visit other solar systems, and we see a planet, and by golly, that planet's right in the middle of the Jurassic period, or some other very formative stage of development, we wouldn't try to impose on them a more sophisticated system because they wouldn't be ready for it. They couldn't use it any more than you would give a motorcycle to a 3-year-old. I guess that's a terrible analogy, but you get the idea. Well, that's the essence of what I wanted to convey. My voice almost held out. And so I'm going to stop now and hope that you understand what I mean by the idea of the reality, physical reality, being like unto the body of God, and the idea of why we have not yet, or if we have been contacted by people from other planet, or that they were probably wisely being discreet about it. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
We hope all of you who have joined us today on Zoom and those of you joining us on Facebook and YouTube, we hope all of you have a very beautiful day, a good weekend, and please visit www.clearwaterbaha'is.org for further Sunday presentations when you're interested. Talk to you soon. Bye.